Alright, in this video we're going to cover how to make the character jump. As you can see here, he jumps off the ground and lands. The first step we're going to do is just make him jump off the ground, but then we're going to cover how to transition into the floating state so he looks like his feet aren't just flat on the ground. And then we're going to cover after that how to make him duck before he jumps so it looks like he's lifting off the ground, and then duck when he lands so it looks like he's hitting and bending back down. So we'll add a little bit more realism into there. And he can also move left and right as he's jumping in the air. And the very last thing we'll cover is how to make him, when he walks off the edge, to automatically default into the drifting down position rather than look like he's continuously walking off the edge. So we'll cover all those different aspects in this video. And so let's get started. In the last video, let's press play real quick. We got the character to walk left and right, and for a sprite to change. We also cover the whole Unity interface and how to do animations and sprite transitions and the coding with Playmaker. So now we're going to create the jumping action. So let's unpause that, or cancel out of there. And this is Unity 5, but it should work in Unity 4 as well, or 4.5 or whatever version. The buttons might be slightly different from the animator tab, but generally the same concept should be there, and just might be slightly different. But alright, so let's go over to the character. So I'll click on him as he's selected in the hierarchy tab. Over here we have the movement. So let's go make a new FSM. I can either go add FSM here, which starts a new one, or I could make one here by adding a new component. But as you can see here, we now have two different Playmaker scripts on here. Both of these are codes, but they're going to be separate from each other, so the jumping won't rely on the movement, and the movement can still move left and right and not matter if it's jumping. So it's better to separate your code that way rather than trying to go over here in the movement and try and mix them and the codes jumping all over the place. Now I can do both at the same time. So I'm going to go click on the FSM tag, and I'm going to call this one jumping. So I have the jumping FSM. Then over in the state mode, we're going to take state 1, and I'm going to call state 1, let's say, let's call them jumping. Now, jump button. So I know if the jump button's been pressed or not. Alright, so in order to check if the jump button's been pressed, let's go to Action Browser, which is right here, and get key down. So I'm going to drag this one in here. And so we're going to get a key down, and to pick the key you can pick whichever one you want. I'm going to use the up arrow because I'd rather save the space bar for the attack button for the sword, but you could use space if you want that to be a jump. But I'm going to click the up arrow. So the up arrow has been selected. Send event, we need to create an event before we can have the option to send an event. So I'm going to go to events, and I'm going to put for the event, let's say jump pressed. So the jump button's been pressed, and you can name these whatever you want. It's just a way of organizing things. So send event, jump pressed, and we're going to get an error because there is no event transition. So I'm going to right click on the add transition, or the jump state, add transition, jump pressed. This gives us the transition to go to the next state. So if the up arrow isn't pressed, we'll go to the next state using the jumped pressed action. We'll add a state. And on this state, I'm going to call this one jumping because he's in the air. So Action Browser. In this state, we're going to put add force 2D. I'm going to drag that in here. And then the physics 2D again was brought in when we imported the Unity 2D package, and the animator package we'll be using next. They don't usually come with Playmaker, they're extra add-ons. Which again are on the Playmaker website right here, Mech and Animator, under the add-ons in Physics Unity 2D. We covered that in the last video if you wanted to double check. So we have the add force 2D. We're going to add a Y force on here, and if I try and click the none, there won't be any options, but I can click these two bars right here, which allows us to type the number in rather than using a preset variable. I'm going to set the jump to being 320. The higher you set it, the higher you're going to jump. The lower you're going to jump. It's basically creating a burst to push the character up into the air. So that's what the add force will do. We don't need to do it every frame, just once, one time up. And once we do that, we'll go to, let's see, add transition, finished. So once it's finished, we'll say jump pressed. We'll go here. That takes off the red exclamation mark. And this one, once it's finished, we'll go back to the jump position. So when the jump button, up arrow is pressed, it'll go to jumping, and jumping will put a 320 acceleration in the Y direction, which is the green arrow vertical, and it'll send them up in the air. And when it finishes that, it'll land back on the ground. So if we press play, character will drop, and if we press up, he flies up, and he'll land back down. So up and down. So we can still move left and right, and now he can move up in the air. So if that's all you're looking for, then great. He moves up in the air. Very simple. He does, however, walk in the air because we haven't put a sprite for him to be in the air. Also, if you keep double tapping, he's going to keep jumping higher and higher in the air because there is nothing to tell him not to double jump. If you're looking for that, for him to keep flying and floating in the air, then great. Otherwise, we might need to adjust that. Also, we probably want to get the camera fixed eventually because right now the camera's not following the character, so when he jumps up, we can't see what's happening. So let's add the camera action in there real quick. So I'll pause this. In order to center the camera, I'm going to take the character and center him kind of in the middle of the screen, and then we'll take the camera right here. And if I drag the camera onto the character, it parents the character to the camera. So whenever the character moves, the camera moves with him. So if I press play now, you'll see that the camera moves with the character. And if I press left and right, you can notice there's a little bit of a glitch where the screen pops a little bit, and that's because my character wasn't centered with the camera. So I'm going to take the camera and drag it back out of the character, and this way they're separate. And then check the character. The character's X is 0.13, so I'm going to zero that out to 0. And now when I check the camera is also 0. So now the numbers both match. So now if I take the camera and parent it to the character, since the numbers are lined up this time 0, 0, when he turns left and right, the camera fluidly pops left and right with him. And the camera will now follow him wherever he goes. So we have a very simple jump, and we have a very simple camera motion. So we're pretty much good there if that's all you're looking for is to jump. Alright, so let's add the animation aspect now. So we're going to go to pull up the Sprites tab. I'm going to add in, let's say, I'll add both the floating and the jumping because I'll code both of those in there. So I'll drag these into the Sprites folder and jump back here. So now I have a floating sprite and a jumping sprite. Both of these are single images, so I don't need to worry about setting the single mode to multi-frame. If I had a sprite cheat and he was actually ducking and spending a couple frames to duck down before he jumps up, then I'd want to go through and cut those out to make sure they work. But since I'm only using a single frame, that'll work for now. I need to attach both of these sprites onto the character now. So if I click on the character, so he's selected, and I go over to animation, I can start adding these sprites to the animation of this sprite character. And again, you have to add it to the character in the scene unless you have one in the project mode. But yeah, it should be on the character in the scene. So we're going to go to walking, and we already have an idle on the walking. So let's create a new clip. And the new clip I'm going to put in the animations folder, and I'm going to call this one floating. And the reason I'm calling it floating is because he could be floating upwards, he could be going downwards. I don't necessarily know if he's falling or if he's rising up. So floating kind of designates that he's in the air at some point. So I'll save that one. And now that I have a floating animation, I'm going to take the floating sprite. And this is just the one frame, but if I had more, I could drag multiple in here and drop him in here. And he's only one frame long, which is fine. I'm going to change the samples from 60 to 30 because I'm using 30 frames per second. And that should be good for that. I'm going to turn the record button off so it stops. And now I'm going to create a new sprite. And I'm going to call this one, I'll put this in animation folder, call this jumping. And under jumping, I'll do the same thing. I'll take the jumping sprite, drop it in here. And I'm going to make this one about, let's say, 4 frames. So if I can slide this, actually let's set this to 30 frames per second, and then slide this to, let's say, 4. I could make it shorter. I can make it 2 frames that he's on the ground. Again, I don't have an animation where he's fluidly ducking, so I'm just going to hold this position for long enough for it to look like he's actually leaving the ground. So 4 should work, and I'm going to click this button right here, which is Add Keyframe, and that will add keyframe. So now I can scroll between frame 1 and frame 4, which is his duck animation. And again, turn off the record button so we're no longer in record. Alright, and I can close up these sprites. Alright, so now that we have the sprites in here, the next step is to code these into the animator. So we have the animator tab right here, and inside the animator tab we have idle and walking. We've already just added floating, and we have jumping as well. So I'll get to these pretty soon. So we can make transitions to make these work, but we also need to code these in here. What's going to happen is we're going to say, we're going to add a couple parameters that will correspond to this occurring. So the first parameter we're going to say, we're going to add a trigger. And what the trigger will do is it'll be a button pushed that initiates the jump. So when the trigger is pushed, we're going to call this the jump button. And you can call this whatever you want. This is your own pre-named variable. And it's a parameter for the animator tab. So from any state, if I right click and make transition, I can drag to pretty much anywhere, but I'm going to go to the floating state for now. I'm going to hold off on the jumping. So we have from any state, right click to get the make transition, and we're going to go to floating. And what determines why this any state goes to floating? We'll click this line which turns blue to show that we're highlighted. And once we're highlighted on here, if we scroll down, we'll see that we have a conditions list. And at the moment, we don't have any conditions. The list is empty. So I'm going to click the plus button, and under HSpeed, I'm going to change that to the jump button. So whereas the HSpeed was a float number that we have, the jump button is going to be a button that we code. So when you press the up arrow, which we have to tell it that the jump button means up arrow, that as soon as this button or trigger has occurred, from any point while he's walking, going anywhere, at any point, once the trigger has fired, he'll go to the floating state. And once he's in the floating state, we're going to go make transition back to the idle state. And how do we know when he leaves this floating position? We need to tell the transition at what point it knows to leave the floating state, otherwise he'll stay floating the whole time. We're going to scroll down here, and we're going to need a new parameter to tell it that. So I'm going to make a new parameter, and I'm going to call this a Boolean value. This is a true and false value, so either it's yes or no, or it's this or it's that. It's a 1 or 2 option, or 0 or 1. It's a true or false type thing. So I'm going to call this one grounded. This way I know if he's on the ground or if he's not on the ground. He's either is or he's not. And so when I click this transition state, again, scroll down, now I can use this grounded parameter. So if I click this, it'll say grounded is true. And you can set it to true or false. But at the moment, if grounded is true, then he'll go to the idle position. So if the trigger is pushed, he'll suddenly be floating, and he'll stay floating until he becomes grounded. And once he's grounded, he'll go to the idle position. Now, we have these parameters set, the jump button and the grounded. However, the code doesn't know to use the animator parameters yet. So I'm going to click on the character in the scene, and I'm going to go to the jump button. So the jump button, once we press the up arrow, he'll go to jump. Once he's in the air, we need to add some values. So we're going to add action browser, animator, and we want to use, actually set animator boolean. So set animator bool, I'll click on that and it drops it in our action browser. And we're going to use the game object owner, which is the character sprite. It's the character jumping. So he's our owner. The parameter is the parameter we've made up here. So this is the jump button. Actually, no, this is the boolean. This is the grounded. So grounded, and this value box right here, this means true and this means false. So if it's checked, it's true, and if it's not checked, it's false. So he is no longer grounded, he is in the air. And we also need to add a trigger. So set animator trigger, drag that underneath. The trigger is going to be the jump button. And again, these parameters have to be spelled exactly the same way they are up here, because the code can only read it if it's the same. So if you use a capital letter or underscore or anything, you need to spell it the exact same way, or else it won't be able to read these two values. So the animator tab is what this code is telling it, and the animator tab is available because we have the Playmaker animator option added to our scene. Without this, we wouldn't have these set of animation menus. So the trigger, we're going to set to the jump button. Oops, and I spelled that one wrong. Button. So when you press the jump button, so once you press up, this gets turned on, or not necessarily on or off, it just gets set. So it's been pushed. And now this has been pushed, he goes to floating, and he's going to stay floating until grounded becomes true. And this right here is asking, when is grounded becoming true? In order to know if it's coming true, we need to go back to the first state. And I'm going to take this and this set where grounded is set to false. I'm going to right click and copy it to make it quicker. And I'm going to go paste it right here. And we're going to set it to true. So as soon as it starts, he's going to be set to true. And I don't have to do this every frame because it only has to turn on true once. Once it's true, it's going to stay true until it becomes false. So it's true until you press the up arrow. Once you press up, it's going to accelerate him off the ground. It's going to set him to not being grounded, so he's false. And the trigger will launch him off, will start playing the animation. So if I press play now, he pops off the ground, and he immediately jumps into the, he goes into the upward states, but then he rises into the idle position. And the reason this is occurring is because he's set to false and set trigger. We also need to add a collision event. So it's basically it's accelerating him into the air, but we don't have a reason for him to go back. So we need to add one more thing. Action browser, we're going to detect when he hits the ground before it sends him back. So collision 2D event, drop this, I'll put this on the bottom. Alright, so what happens is as soon as it launched him off the ground, it would set him to not being grounded and play the floating animation because he's leaving the ground, and as soon as it started playing floating, it goes back here and tells him he's false, that he is on the ground, and or the true that he is on the ground, and it's going to wait for the arrow key again. We need to tell it not to go back immediately to the jump button. So by doing the on collision, we're going to say on collision enter. So it's going to enter a collision tag, and we're going to do send event as finished. So it won't go finished on this event until he's collided with the ground. In order for it to know that it's on the ground, we need to tag the ground with the ground icon, or tag. At the moment, there's none here, and if I click and switch out where it takes the word none away, there's a couple tags here. None of these will really, you could use these, but I'm going to add a tag, and over here pops out a list, and the list is empty. And if I didn't want to add it here, I could also go alternatively I click on any of these objects, ground or character. And you can see it says untagged right here. I can click and you get the same options, and you can add a tag from this window as well. So whether you wanted to add it from the Playmaker window or here, we can go add tag. In Unity 4 or 4.5 or whatever that is, it'll look slightly different, where it's going to already have an element with a 0, 1, 2, 3, and that basically lists different options to add them in here. But in Unity 5, they just have a plus sign. So you click the plus and you type in what tag you want. I'm going to call this the ground tag. I'll use a capital G. Alright, so I have the ground tag set in here. Press enter to confirm it. And then we can go back to the ground, and the ground is still untagged. We created a tag, so let's use that tag now called ground. So the ground sprite or the ground object that's sitting in our scene right here has a ground tag attached to it. So now if I go back to the character, when he's jumping, when he enters collision 2D with the collide tag of ground, so you could have any number of ground sprites, but as long as you tag him ground, once he collides with anything tagged as a ground, and here's your tags, the character doesn't necessarily need a tag at the moment, we're not coding him with a tag yet, but the ground has a tag. At that point he'll go to finish, so he won't go to finished, which will ask for the jump button again until he's collided with the ground. This also takes out the double jump because he can no longer rise off the ground or keep rising until he's collided again. So if I keep pressing up, he won't keep colliding or keep rising until he's re-collided with the ground. So from now on, he'll just go up. And he still reverses the direction because we have the direction coded under movement, so that already takes care of our left and right switching. So the jumping, so they both run concurrently because we have them on two separate Playmaker codes, the movement and the jumping. So he can move left and right, and he moves just fine. When he jumps, he'll leave the ground at any state. So here's where the any state comes in. So he's constantly idling and walking, depending on how you're doing that. But as soon as up is triggered, it jumps to the floating state and stays floating until this parameter, or this parameter, is equivalent to true, meaning he is grounded. And if that's all you're looking for to get him to jump off the ground, then you're fine. But let's make this a little more realistic. You can also notice that when he hits the ground, he doesn't immediately transition to the standing state. That's because the transition here, if you click on these settings here, Unity 4 doesn't have this, but Unity 5 has these options for settings, the transition duration. If we set this to 0, he'll immediately transition back to the idle as soon as he contacts the ground. He won't wait. So if I press up now, he immediately drops to the ground and his feet come out. He doesn't hold there in that vertical position for like a portion of a second. So again, settings, it says a Unity 5 feature. 4, you don't have to worry about this. He just automatically works. Alright, so now that we have this, let's incorporate something more realistic where he's actually ducking to jump rather than just floating off the ground. As you can see here, he's magically floating up and into the jump position. When he hits the ground, he just lands flat-footed and spreads his feet back out. So let's change this one. So this is our jump button pressed, our conditions for jump button. I'm going to delete this by highlighting the blue and pressing delete on the keyboard. And now I'm going to right click here and make transition and drag this to the jumping state. So once we're on the jumping state, we're going to change this one, the same thing we had before. We're going to make this the jump button pressed. So once the jump button trigger has been initiated, he'll go to jumping. It'll play the jumping animation. And they'll right click, make transition, and go to the floating animation. So what determines when this leaves? We're going to say that he's going to leave jumping and go to floating on exit time. However, he doesn't have, he only has 4 frames, so that works just fine. He'll just be ducking, so we don't necessarily have an animation, but the exit time means that the sprite will finish playing. If you have like a 5-second long sprite, it'll finish the 5 seconds before it starts transitioning to here. So we have 4 frames of him just kind of bending down before he launches off the ground. So that'll work just fine. And again, the settings right here, the transition duration, this is kind of, again, making it last longer than it needs to. Unity 5 has this option on here, so we can take a look and see how that works. But I'm going to leave this there for now and just try it and see what happens. So he's going to duck down for a duration of about 4 frames, and then he'll start floating off the ground. So if I press play, he'll duck and start floating up. As you can see here, he's kind of starting to duck in the air before he even leaves the ground, so that's not exactly what we want. So let's go back to the settings and let's zero that back out. Now let's press play. So now he immediately starts ducking instead of delaying before he's in the air, but he's still leaving the air while in ducking position. So what we'd like to do is to have him wait before he leaves the ground. This way it plays the sprite while he's on the ground. Right now, he's coded to start accelerating off the ground before the animation has even finished playing. The animation's waiting before it reverts into the floating state. As you can see here, it's waiting long enough, but his position isn't holding him. So let's exit out of that, go back to the character, and we need to add a transition in here. So we have the jump button pressed, and he's grounded. So when we go to jumping, we need to add we'll put it on here, a wait. So if I take the wait, I'll leave it down here. We'll wait, and we'll do probably, let's say 0.4. That should be long enough. And finish event, we'll go to finished. So we also need to create another event. I'm going to add, or create another state. Add state. I'm going to call this state I guess I'll call it floating, maybe. So, or maybe I should call it check jumping, or check landing. Probably better the option. Alright, so jumping would be more of the floating. Check landing is to see if he's going to land on the ground yet. Alright, so we're going to take the finished here and drag it to check landing and create a new transition finished here and send this back to jump button. So we're going to press the jump button to jump up. He's going to be jumping, playing the animation, and then it's going to check for the landing when he occurs. So on this one, I don't want to add the force yet. So I'm going to take this one and Control X to cut it off, and Control V to paste it on here. So what we have now is that when the jump button is pressed, he's no longer grounded. The trigger has fired to launch him, or to start playing the jumping animation. The collision enter, we're not going to check for this yet, so let's Control X and paste it underneath this one. So I have the force, we'll get back to that. So we have the grounded, jump button pressed, and then wait. So we have the, when the jump button is pressed, it starts the animation cycle. So the animation boolean is set to grounded, he's starting to play jumping, and he's not actually physically moving for 0.4 frames. When he does start moving, when the 0.4 is over, he'll go to finished. In the meantime, his jump has been started, and then it goes to finished, and then it lifts him off the ground, and then it starts checking to see if he hits the ground again. This allows the time for the animation to finish playing the jumping sprite before it moves it to the floating sprite and waits for him to hit the ground again. So if we press play now, he pauses and then gets ready to leave the ground. It looks like the 0.4 is probably too long. So let's change that again. Let's try a 0.1 on that. Okay, so that works a bit better. So he pauses for 0.1 of a second. Yeah, it's a tenth of a second, so that works. So he ducks and then he launches off the ground. So you can change your wait time to something else, so it's not immediately he's leaving the ground. He's ducking for a portion of a second and then lifting off the ground. So he can walk, he can duck. The last thing, let's make him a little more realistic on the landing so he doesn't land flat-footed. So we're going to go create a landing state. I don't actually have a landing state, so I'm going to reuse the jumping animation. So let's right-click, create state, empty, and I'm going to call this one landing. So we have a landing animation. And I'm going to set the, I'm going to take the transition, actually no, under floating where it has the little bullseye, I'm going to pick the jumping animation again. If I had a landing animation, I'd put a landing animation, but the fact that he bends down for jumping will look like he's bending down to land also, so I'm going to reuse that. So now, actually I put that in the wrong one. That's floating. Click landing. The landing has none at the moment. Click the bullseye, go to the assets, and jumping. Alright, so jumping and landing have the same jumping animation, but this one we'll call landing. So we're going to go from floating to landing. So I'm going to take this one, right click, make transition, and go to landing. And what determines when he's landing? The same thing that determines right here which is the grounded condition. So I'm going to right click, or click that to make it blue and press the delete key on the keyboard. I'm going to take that transition off. So this will be the grounded transition now. Grounded is true, he goes to landing. So he's jumping and he's staying jumping until he finishes his 4-frame jump animation. Then he's going to stay floating until, actually we don't want the exit time floating, he's going to stay, he doesn't need exit time. If his clothes are flapping, his hair is blowing, you probably still wouldn't need the exit time anyway. And the settings, we probably want to get rid of this. Again, Unity 5 has this settings option, and this will delay your animations and cause them to, he will be stuck in that vertical position for a bit longer before you actually went to the ducking position. So we don't want to use any durations. So then he'll go to the landing, and what gets him out of the landing? He needs to go now to the idles or the walking, and we need to determine which one. So right click, make transition, and I'll make transitions for both of these. So how does he know, does he go to walking or idle once he hits the ground? Landing, we do want to finish the animation, so he has those 4 frames of ducking. I don't want any transition duration that messes up the animations. We'll add H speed again. So H speed is, let's say, less than 0.1, like we covered in the first tutorial. If his horizontal speed is less than 0.1 when he lands, he's probably going to idle. But if you click this transition and again add H speed, if it's greater than 0.1 when he lands, so you're still holding the keyboard left button or the right button, if it's greater than 0.1 when he lands, he should land in the walking mode. So it knows which one to transition to. We adjusted the other one. Let's change this one as well. Let's get rid of that transition duration so he lands and immediately goes into the sprite that we want. So now we have this flowing pattern. So let's press play on that. So now when he plays, he'll jump and duck when he lands. So wherever he lands, so whether he's moving, he'll go into another position. Also of note, we see when he lands, he's still sliding the ground for a little bit. His duck position is probably playing for a little bit too long. So in order to change that, I'm going to go over to the landing sprite, and I'm going to change the speed to 2, which will play it twice as fast. So if I press play now, when he lands, he'll land a lot faster. See, ducks a lot quicker now. So when he hits the ground, you won't really notice his feet dragging, because it'll be a lot faster, but he'll still have, at least for a little bit of a fraction of a second, the fact that he bends down when he hits, which looks a little more realistic. And again, you could make a specific landing sprite, but I'm just going to reuse the jumping sprite. And we have a character realistically jumping and moving. Alright, at this point, we can start building our level. So I'm going to pause that. I'm going to go to the scene mode and zoom out a little bit so I have something to work with. I'm going to take this ground plane right here, and I'm going to drop the ground plane in the project tab. By doing this, it creates a prefab, and the ground plane turns blue. What this means is that this is now the primary object, and all of these are copies. So if you change this one in the project tab, every one of these instances in your hierarchy will change also. So you only have to recode one if you're putting code on the ground. But you can also reuse it. The benefit is if I drop another one, let's say, I'll put one right here. It copies, since it already comes with the collider edge, because we made a prefab of an object that already had a collider. We already have the ground tag to it and the sprite renderer with the ground on it. So whatever you do and add to this will get copied, and you just keep dropping lots of copies out, rather than doing the whole process again of creating a brand new sprite, attaching the sprite you want to it, redrawing the edge collider. So it's just an easy way to keep dropping some more in the scene. And I can kind of build the scene however I want it to look like. So put something like there so I have a longer platform. And I could even make like one up here if I wanted him to possibly be able to jump up to the next section. It might be too high for him, but we'll see. Alright, so if I press play, yep, he can make it appear. Also note, see how he's hiding behind the grass? If you like that option, you can have that. Otherwise, you can change that. If I pause this And let's go to the character now. The character has an order in his layer. During the sprite render, his order in layer, let's set it to 1. A higher number means it comes forward towards the screen. So if I press play now, the ground is still tagged as a layer order of 0, but he is tagged as a layer order of 1. So he'll be in front of all the grounds now instead of in front of the grass. So you can alternate those by doing positive or I suppose negative numbers also. And you can organize what goes in front of what. And so now we have the character walking and jumping, and you can pretty much build any kind of level you want at this point. Alright, so there's one more thing to fix. There's one more, I guess glitch, not really glitch, but modification we can make. Notice if he walks off the edge, he's still walking in the air. He's not automatically transitioning like he does when we jump. He's just going to keep walking in the air. Once you've jumped, he's going to stay jumping. Oops, we got stuck. But when he falls off an edge, he's not transitioning to falling. He's just staying walking the whole time. So let's modify that real quick. All right, in order to do that, we have a movement FSM, a jumping FSM. Let's add one more FSM, finite state machine. And we're going to call this FSM tag, we're going to call this falling. So what falling means is that if he's walking off an edge, he'll default into the falling position without us having to press the jump button to get him into that falling position. So in the falling position, we're going to go to state 1. In this state, we're going to call this check falling. In the check falling state, we're going to add, let's go to the set animator, and we're going to make a Boolean value. And for this Boolean value, it's going to be pretty much similar to how we did the other one. We're going to set the parameter being grounded, and grounded is true because he's on the ground. And then we're going to add another Boolean, and we need to add one more state to the animator. So go into animator, we'll add another Boolean, and we're going to call this one floating so we can tell whether he's floating or not. So he doesn't have to go to the jump button being pushed, he can automatically go straight to floating. So the floating is a Boolean, which again is a true or false, yes or no statement. Now we have a floating value. So let's go back to the code on the character. We're going to call this floating as well. And again, these names have to be letter for letter, uppercase, lowercase, specific to what you typed for there. Floating is going to be false, so I'm not going to check that. So we have grounded is true, floating is false, and we're going to do one more. Action browser collision. Collision 2D event, drag that into our window right here. And I'm going to say on collision exit. So he's exiting the ground. He's no longer on the ground. And the collide tag, again, is none. We're going to click these bars right here, which will allow us to pick our options. I'm going to click ground. So when this character exits the ground, we're going to send event. We don't have an event yet, so we can't send any. So we're going to make an event. I'm going to call this event floating because he's floating. You could call it falling because he's falling, but floating or falling works just fine. So I'm going to call this floating, and there's an error here because it's not used here. So let's right click, add transition, floating. So now it's floating here. And that's all we need for this. We don't need to store anything. So when he exits the ground, he'll go to the floating state. So we need to right click, add state. We're going to call this floating. So we're going to drag a line to the floating state. And in floating, it's pretty much the same thing as the last one. So I could probably even just delete the state, copy this, paste this. Do you want to replace the current start state? Nope. I just want to make a copy. So I'm going to call this one falling. And I'm going to reverse everything. So he's no longer grounded, it's false. He is floating, it's true. And I'm not going to check if he's exiting, I'm going to check if he's entering. So I've reversed everything. So if he's entering the ground, collide with ground, then send event to, we don't have any option here. So I'm going to add a transition finished, and I'm going to right click, remove or delete that transition. So now I have a finished option, finished, and send back to there. So floating goes to falling, and once he collides or enters with the ground, then he's no longer floating. So he's grounded, he's not floating, he's exiting, so he must be floating. So he's floating now, so he's not grounded, he is floating, and he's entering the ground, and he should be fine. So the last thing we need to say is make transition to floating, and what's going to make him go straight to floating and not jumping. We're going to go use our new parameter called floating, and when floating is true, he'll bypass jumping and go straight to floating. So we press play and see what we get. So he walks over, and he immediately jumps into floating mode because he has left the ground plane. He jumps up to here. So if I just walk off, he goes straight to floating because he's no longer contacting the ground and bypasses the whole need to press the jump button. So also of note, see how he sometimes glitches like this, where he's like, he enters jump mode just by walking. So he's not leaving the ground, but he's glitching up and down like that. He gets stuck in this position. What's happening here is that the ground isn't quite even, and any little bump at the speed and velocity he's moving could float him up into the air just like a pixel or so. And when he hits back down, it's causing this glitch because he's leaving the ground and hitting the ground again. So in order to fix this little bit of a glitch, we're going to determine, is he actually in the air? Even though he technically is by a pixel, we want to know if he's actually really falling or not. So we're going to add one more last little bit to the code to fix this little glitch where he's thinking he's leaving the ground. So we're going to pause that, go back to the character, and we're going to remodify this. So we're going to move falling down here, and we're going to make one more state. And this state's going to be, we're going to call this check falling. Whoops, we already have one called check falling. Check fall speed. So we're going to check how fast is he really falling. So this one will go from floating to check fall speed. And then we're going to make a transition, finished, so he'll go to floating. But we're going to make one more transition. I'm going to call this one, let's call it not falling. So you can call it whatever you want. So I'm going to add this transition as not falling and drag it back to here. Alright, so what's happening is we've determined that he's left the ground. Now we're going to determine how fast he's really moving, and if he's not really moving that fast, then he'd go back to here. But if he is, then make him look like he's falling. So on this state, we need to check some velocities. So we're going to go get velocity 2D, drag that in the scene. We're going to get the y velocity. But we can't store the y velocity because we don't have a variable. So let's make a variable. I'm going to call this the y velocity, and it'll be a float number for us, which means decimal place number. Go back to the state, and y velocity will save as the y velocity. So we're getting his velocity at any moment, which we'll click every frame. So at every second all the time, while he's determined he's been off the ground now, it's going to check his y velocity and save it. Now that we've saved his y velocity, we're going to take a float absolute value. The reason we're taking the float, which will basically take the number from a negative to a positive, so we're going to take that y velocity, is because when he's falling down or going up, it could be positive or negative depending on either or. And we just want to compare the major difference between the two, so we don't really care if it's positive or negative, we just want to know what the number is. So we're going to do every frame as well. So we're going to take the y velocity, we're going to make it a positive number by taking the absolute value of it. We're going to take one more thing in here. We're going to go float compare and drag that at the bottom. So, and the order is kind of important on this one. We're going to get the velocity, we're going to make it absolute, and then we're going to compare it. So you don't want to rearrange these things and have these out of order. but you can see here you can move them around. So I'm going to leave this last. Now we're going to compare two numbers. This is a number. I don't need a number. I need a variable. So I'm going to click this one, which will take the y velocity, because this changes every second of the game, every fraction of a second. So this is his y velocity. It's constantly changing. We're going to compare this to, let's try 0.3. And you can change this number. This number will determine how you fix the glitch. So you might need to play around with that depending on how big your sprites are and how you modify this. That's the number you need to worry about. So we're going to say if his velocity is less than 0.3, so it's already a positive number, so it doesn't matter if it's going up or down. If it's less than 0.3, then he's not really falling. But if his velocity is more than 0.3, then he really is floating. And actually I used finished. So I'm just going to delete this transition and add a new one. I'll call it floating, just to keep the names more organized. All right, so we have these now. So again, if he has a very tiny velocity of 0.3, then he's not really falling. Go back and check to see if he really is off the ground. And by that point, a frame or two later, he'll be back on the ground if he really wasn't off the ground that long. But if his velocity is any more than 0.3, he might actually really be falling. And we'll go back to the falling state. We don't need to check it every frame. We just need to do it once. And then it'll determine, and it'll divide between the two of these. If he is falling, then change all these animator tabs and make him really fall. So if we press play now, when he walks left and right, everything still works. And we can see that he's, looks like he glitched for a second right there when we turn him around. So I can change that number to, let's say, 0.4. And let's see what happens there. Alright, so he's walking. And it looks like he's working pretty well now. He's not glitching on the ground anymore when we go left and right. But if you go too high of a number, sometimes he keeps walking off the ledge instead of transitioning to a falling state. So it looks like he's transitioning pretty well, but you might need a smaller number otherwise. So he walks and he falls, and right there you can see that he kept walking off the edge. So we might need to go back to 0.3. So here's where, again, you would just keep playing with this number until you find maybe 0.35 would work better. But let's try 0.3 again. So if I walk left and right, there's a slight glitch again where he's doing that. So let's try 0.35. So that subtle velocity difference. And again, he's walking off the edge here. So again, just playing with these numbers, I think 0.4 is probably working the best. So I'll put this back on 0.4. But otherwise, that about covers it. So we have the ability for the character to jump up and down now. He'll realistically duck and lift up and then hit the ground. He'll move left and right, and he can jump, and you can start building your level however you like. And when he walks off an edge, he'll go right into that fall position. And he doesn't glitch on the ground. So we should be good for this demo. So the next demo should be enemy movement, so we're adding enemies to our game.